Hey DTS family, my name is John Dyer and I'm excited because I get to give you our fall 2024 enrollment report to let you know how we're doing on our centennial year. But I'm also going to get to look over the entire centennial and look at what's happened over the last 100 years and think about how gracious God has been to this institution. So let's jump in. First, I just want to follow our centennial theme of thankful, grateful, hopeful. So we are thankful for what God's been doing in the past. We're grateful for what's happening now in the present, and then we're hopeful for the future, and hopefully you'll be able to see that as we go along. So we'll start with that grateful in the middle of where are we right now, and then we'll look back at what we can be thankful for. So first off, I just want to look at the fall 2024 enrollment. We have 2,634 students enrolled. And you can see also the hours and new students there. And I wish I could say we had gone up by 0.5% instead of down by 0.5% on students. But we're in a really healthy category because sometimes the students fluctuate just a teeny bit depending on how many students graduate and things like that. But here we have a bunch of new students and they're taking a healthy amount of hours, which means that we're able to fulfill our mission of equipping godly servant leaders. So how did we get to this number? Let me just kind of show you that real quick. Our enrollment cycle usually looks like this. In a spring term, we have a group of students. We had about 2,600 in the spring. Then things change over the course of the summer. And so some students stay in, and then some students graduate, which is awesome. We're sending them out into ministry. And then some students take a semester off or withdraw. And we refill those with some who are brand new students and some who are returning from a prior break. And so in a given semester, we might have more graduates or more newer returning students. So in this case, we had a few more graduates, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But to look at what we can be really both thankful and grateful for in this last year, let's just look at the last 5 years specifically. So the year, Dr. Bailey's last year was 2019, and we had almost 2,500 students doing really well. And then all of a sudden in the spring of 2019, COVID hit, and we were really worried in a sense that what was going to happen to education and what was going to happen to America and the whole rest of the world. And, you know, by God's grace in that time, we actually went up by a few students, even though they took a little bit fewer hours. Things were still really healthy, and as an institution, we praise the Lord for that. And as we adjusted, built more online programs, more online delivery that we had to do during COVID, but now could open up more things to more people. We saw a growth in students, a growth in hours. We came out of that era, and Dr. Yarbrough's really first full year. And that was really strong. And then we, transitioned systems, had a nice flat year where we only went up by one student, but we always say that every student matters and students aren't just a number. And so this was a fun thing that we could see right there in the numbers that every student mattered. Then, we had inflationary pressures and some difficulties in those years, but still were able to grow last year, even though we went down in terms of the number of hours that students took. And this last year, we've just been really kind of healthy and flat for our centennial year. So the reason why it went down a couple students, though, has to do with just a great graduating class. So our May 2024 graduation was one of the highest. So let me look at now back at the 100 years so you can see that graduation in a little bit more detail. This is the whole century. This is every graduating class starting in 1928 and how it's grown over time. And you can see this divided up into THM, master's, and doctoral programs. But notice there at the end, this sort of up and down for the last 5 years. So whenever there is a big graduating class, we typically have a flat year. And then when there's a little bit less, we often grow that year. So it just fluctuates a little bit depending on students when they're coming in and what they're finishing. And this year in particular, there was a couple of really interesting things happening. So we have this little registration pattern where we ask students to register by July 1st, and we start measuring around that time. Then we have a payment deadline in the middle of August, a couple weeks before the semester starts, and so there's some ups and downs there. I just want to show you something interesting that happened, and that here's a pretty typical pattern: is that we have a bunch of students right at July 1st, and they increase through the summer. We drop a little bit during the payment deadline, and we pop back up for the semester. We did even better in 23, but 24 you'll see a really different pattern where it starts out behind and then really kind of crashes around the payment deadline. But again, by God's grace, we pop back up and are just behind where we were the year before. Part of this is that during the summer we had a lot of new initiatives and programs happening that all kind of came through at the last minute. So here's just a couple of things going on. Our board and our pastoral formation and pastoral ministries department created a new pastor formation cohort where we've got a set of students who are going through together to be senior pastors in the future. That's not right now a bunch of new students, but it really is reformulating a program that we hope brings in a lot of new students in the future. We also had some awesome new full ride scholarships due to the generosity of our donors, and then an amazing new global leaders program where we're looking for 100 students around the world to study online for a couple of years and then come to Dallas for a couple of years and go back to their home country. And overall, this past fall, that probably produced around 35, maybe 40 new students. And then we also did a bunch of first-class free initiatives for the Centennial to bring people back out of, that would normally have been students. So for those who were already graduates that wanted to come back for a postgraduate certificate, we did that for the first-class free there. Also for those that had done Story of Scripture events throughout the U.S. and the world that Dr. Yarbrough's been running. And then also for those who have been our donors faithfully but haven't taken a class before. And then those who are taking our free classes to the Global Institute. That probably produced another 65 students. So about 100 of our new students are in these interesting initiatives. So when you look at this movement, you can kind of see you can see a flat year and then up and a flat and an up and then another flat. And each of these corresponds to those big graduating classes and also new initiatives happening. So always lots of really interesting things going on here. Things to be grateful and hopeful for through the past and into the future. So I want to look at now, just where our student body population has been over the last century. So this is a big chart of how the student body has grown over time. So you see some periods of flat, some periods of growth, some periods of struggle and growth again. And so I want to walk you through, how did this happen? What are some of the key factors that play into this? And I think the number one factor, of course, that we want to acknowledge always is just the grace of God in this. This is not perfect people doing all the right things, but God's grace throughout this. But there are probably three big categories that have been stronger as we have diversified in demographics, degree, and delivery. Each of those movements has produced something great in our student body. So here's a way of visualizing this just a little bit more. Let me kind of tighten this up into the presidential eras. So we start with our presidents, Chafer, and then Walford in the 50s, and then Campbell, Swindoll, and Bailey, and then Dr. Yarbrough since 2020. You can see the color bands showing about where the student body was right at the end. I should mention here for a moment that this enrollment chart, we didn't always have computer systems when the school started. And so a lot of these are on different pieces of paper throughout time. And so we've collected all of these with the library team and the registrar team and others. So this is sort of an eclectic text, almost like the Nessel-Allen. This is sort of the Hun-Hobson enrollment pattern. So there may be some numbers that may be slightly different in different reports, but this is a pretty good showing of where we've been over the last century and God's grace in that. So I also want to show you not just the presidents, though, but this pattern of degrees, demographics, and delivery, and how each of these movements has shaped the institution in some really amazing ways. I start out in the 20s. We had a MDiv, we had a bachelor's degree. Early on, added a THD. But we have our first international student in 1928, and here it's Canadian students and then students from Ireland and Northern Ireland, which probably would have been pretty interesting in that era to have people from both those countries. The THM program, as it stands now, was created in 1935, and if you think it's long now at 120 hours and robust, it was 140 hours back in 1935. So it's actually got a little bit tighter in terms of the number of hours. And then one other thing just to point out is that we changed our name to Dallas Theological Seminary, or introduced that for the first time in 1937, and I put there under delivery just because that in one sense anchors us with the name Dallas, but also shows us that our core DNA of having all 66 books and rigorous training in the THM, but also having students from all over the world, again, starting in places like Canada and Ireland, but moving out to the Philippines and onward pretty quickly, that these are all part of our strengths early on, a global focus, a deep structure of the Bible in our curriculum, and then trying to figure out different ways to deliver that. Then we move on into the Walford era, and we see this era where we have our first black student, we have the MABS in summer school, and our first female students. This represents some pretty significant shifts. And when we think about our first black student, it's unfortunate that when DTS was founded, that integrated education wasn't something that you could really do here in Texas. And then when it did open up, DTS was probably a little bit slow in really opening the doors and welcoming in black students. And so even though that might be a little bit of a sad part of our history, at the same time, this is not a history again about perfect people making perfect decisions. This is about God's grace. And so we look at this, we go, man, this moment where we opened up more of the school to more people, you just see incredible growth. So we have the school desiring to not just have fall and spring, but have summer school, to not just have a THM program that is for senior pastors, but also develop the MABS, a 2-year program that then could equip people who are doing other types of jobs and associate pastor roles, to have female students to really equip the whole body of Christ to serve the whole country and then again in the world. And really you notice that those 3 decisions that Walford and Campbell made, that really leads to the single greatest growth that we have in the seminary in this period of the 70s, where there's just a real spike in growth. And then it kind of plateaus a little bit through the 80s, and there's some struggles there in the decade of the 80s that Dr. Campbell really led us through, and then Swindoll comes in and brings kind of a breath of fresh air and of excitement in ministry. And so you can see some shifts even in our curriculum there. So we have our Demon program comes in. And then we have our first extension site under Dr. Campbell down in San Antonio, so beginning to spread where and how we do classes. And then a big shift with our MA in counseling program, because what that does is says not just senior pastors and church associate pastors, but also even people who are going to be maybe ministering outside of a church setting with counseling practices and integrating the best of theology and Bible, but also what's out there with psychology and what we're learning about how people think and how they change. And so we see that movement with the MAC. And then we see a variety of different MAs that I can't even list here coming out through the 90s and early 2000s. And then our big first initiative to have our first online class in the summer of 2023, we had Dr. Pentecost's first online class that we put together there in 2003. And then we also have one more MA program that's worth mentioning, the MBTS, which is a 36-hour degree. With these shifts in degrees, this represents one more shift to where all the previous programs were for people in full-time ministry. The MBTS represents us wanting to serve those people who are not going into full-time ministry, but wanting to still learn at the seminary level. And so at 36 hours, it's just a tremendous amount of education, so much more than most pastors full-time and the rest of the world would have. So each of these degrees, you can see a shift and a widening of what DTS is doing. And then we begin to widen it in terms of language. So we have our first Chinese class in 2006, first Spanish class in 2016. And then more recently, like we just mentioned a bit ago, the Global 100, where we are studying in English, but around the world using this online delivery system, hearkening back to that first international student in 1928, that you can see God's grace in these shifts all throughout the seminary. Just an amazing story here of what God has done through the seminary. So I hope that's a fun little history. If we want to go back to look at the present again, so we're looking back and we're thankful for that, but we're also grateful for right now. And I want to just kind of show you where DTS has ended up over the last couple of years. So if we go back to 2008, DTS is right in there, but you got all of these green schools that are non-denominational and the blue schools that are the SBC schools. And so you see that, as these things are moving throughout the 2010s and coming into the impact of COVID in 2020, just by God's grace, DTS is just kind of hanging in there, just doing well, growing bit by bit. Each time we add a new degree program or delivery, we end up doing pretty well. And so where a number of schools have really struggled to make these transitions, God's been really gracious to DTS. And so just one more look at this. If we look over on the SBC side, the 6 big SBC schools are doing well, particularly MBTS, Midwestern Seminary, has been doing well, whereas the rest of them have been struggling a little bit. And if we look at the totality of evangelical seminaries over on the right, or non-denominational seminaries, there's been a real struggle in the last couple of years, moving down a bit from about 10,000 students to 8,000. And meanwhile, in the Lord's kindness, DTS has been growing in this time. So we're just really appreciative of that. Like I mentioned, this has to do with those demographics, degrees, and delivery. So just want to give you a little more detail on those. So on the demographic side, where we are right now is about 56%, 43% male and female. Then if we look at our different categories that our iPads here in the U.S. has us record, we have about almost 20% of our students are international. And that international grouping there is students studying in Spanish and Chinese who are non-citizens around the world, but it's also our students who are studying in English here in the U.S. or around the world. So these could be students in Australia or the Philippines or Nigeria, but they're coming to the U.S. or studying from their home countries in English. And then the other American racial categories, some of our Spanish and Chinese students are in those categories because they're studying here in the U.S. and are U.S. citizens. But this represents a good chunk of America and a good chunk of the world here in our race, ethnicity, and nationality. And then also in age, we don't always think about that as part of what we think of as diversity, but here you can see the age range of students is quite wide. So there's about a quarter in their 20s, a quarter in their 30s, a quarter in their 40s, and a quarter in their 50s or above. So it's a little bit more in the 20s and 30s, a little bit less in the 40s and above. But really, if you come into a DTS classroom, you're really going to see just someone from every stage and every walk of life, every country, every tribe, tongue, and nation. And so there's neither Jew nor Greek or male nor female in the DTS student body, but they're all one in Christ, which is pretty amazing to see. And you can see this just kind of visualized in our graduates when those first female students start here, and then we begin to see them continue to grow. So really in the last couple of decades, most of our growth has been in female students and in minority and international students. So a lot of great demographic change over the course of our history. And then we look at our programs. We started out with a THM. One of our first MAs was MACE. So we have a bunch of degrees in that area of leadership and teaching, but we added the MA in counseling, and we have one for licensed counseling, and our new MACO, which is for those that are not going into licensed counseling. And then a couple of years ago in 2020, we added the chaplaincy degree for those going into military or hospital, but also doing care type ministries and other settings as well. And then a variety of just really neat specialized ministries, from apologetics to Bible translation, a broad Christian studies degree, intercultural ministries and missions, Jewish studies, and media arts and worship. So just a great set of specialized degrees. And then for those, again, that are not going to full-time ministry, we have the MBTS and the graduate certificate. And then for grads that want to come back, we have the postgraduate certificate that can help be enriching and growing. And on the doctoral side, we have kind of this range from church to the academy. So on the church side, we added the DMin in the 1980s, but we've had our PhD, or what was originally a THD, back from the 1920s. So those were our two degrees we had for a long time. We've added some degrees in between. So we have the pastor and the scholar, but we also have those who are really in a more formal teaching setting and those who are doing more administration and need doctoral training there. So a great range on both the master's side and the doctoral side. And the way that kind of plays out here is that we got leadership and teaching is still about a third of what we do in terms of education for the THM, MACL, and MACE. A growing, counseling and care area, a big chunk of the specialized ministries, and really a large chunk that are coming for enrichment that aren't, again, going into full-time ministry, and our doctoral program is rounding that out. So it's a really neat, diverse set in terms of who the people are coming in, but also what they're doing. I did want to mention one other thing, too, about our THM program. Over the last 15 years or so, we were starting to see a decline through the early 2010s. And so, we created the last year free program to help scholarship those last 24 hours. And you can see a little pop in 2016 because of that, and really a stabilization. And then, post-COVID, you see a little bit of a decline again. But this last year, that Global 100 plan has then brought that back up a little bit. And we also have a new exciting scholarship coming this next year that will roll out pretty soon. And so we hope to see that THM stabilized even as we grow in other areas. So I can show you some more degree detail. I'll leave this up, but you can pause it if you want to see this. This is our traditional THM and MA programs. And then you can also see over here our enrichment programs and our doctoral programs. So feel free to look at those. The last thing to look at is just our delivery methods. We kind of group these into Dallas, sort of that traditional weekly classes, all of our distance education in our various sites around the U.S., and then online and digital. And so we've traditionally looked at things in terms of each of our locations and what label the students wear. But we've noticed over time that when we look at this kind of data, students are not just Dallas, not just online, not just Houston, they're not just an extension site. They're really using a variety of different classes, and so we're wanting to rethink that a little bit. So if we look at a map and we see students that label themselves Dallas versus online, and you can see them cluster around Houston, Atlanta, and DC in our various distance locations. But you can also see that it's really mixed in here. And so you can see a student here in South Georgia labels themselves in Atlanta, but someone else closer to Atlanta labels themselves online. So we're beginning to think of these students more in a regional format. And so I'll shift this over here. Notice that there's no students in this graph labeled as online, but we're really thinking every student in some sense is taking a mixture of online classes and in-person hybrid classes. And so we want to treat them in this way and help them find a sense of community so that they're not just online students, but they're students that are in the Northeast or in the Southeast or in the kind of South region or Midwest. And so we're beginning to service students in that way and begin to have them more of a group identity so that they are in a region, but then attending classes at a campus or extension site. So if we think about our campuses and extension sites this way, but we were able to break it up into regions, we'd see we have doctoral students all over the country and all over the world, about 300 of them. But then there's a set of students in Dallas. So sometimes if we just look at who is labeled Dallas, it's 668, but there's actually more than 800 students in the DFW area. Down in Houston, too, there's more students in the area than wear that label of Houston. So the Houston team's doing a great job down there. Down in the whole kind of southern and Texas region, we've got a large chunk of students there, including Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Louisiana. And if we just kind of go around over on the west side, Midwest, up at our DC campus, we have 130 students, but that campus does a great job of reaching out to all of those students, that more than 200 in the area. And then the Southeast, again, the Atlanta campus is an amazing place to go, but in the Southeast, there is a bunch of students that campus is serving, and our other regional sites as well. Now, globally too, though, we have more than 150 students who are studying in English around the world, not anywhere in the U.S. So those students are important as well. And then our global Chinese and Spanish students, some of whom are in the U.S., some of whom are around the world. About 50 of our Chinese students are actually in the Dallas area. So we're beginning to not just regionalize the U.S., but also regionalize the rest of the world as that initial vision to reach all nations that Chafer had. Even with early international students, we begin to see this in our regions. And so if we look at our languages and how they're breaking down, we can see that each of our formal language programs is beginning to grow. Our Spanish program is almost 200 students, and Chinese program is almost 150 students. So if we take those two together and we add them up, we actually have more students in our global programs than there were when Chafer ended at the seminary. So with about 350 students, that's just amazing that we have more students, not studying in English than we had in English when Chafer passed away. That's just something for us to celebrate. And as we look at our global map, we have students that are showing interest from really almost every country in the world, and so we're wanting to figure out how to serve those. So again, there's a lot to be thankful for when we look at the past of God's grace and what He's done. There's a lot to be grateful for the present and just where we are as an institution to be healthy in this environment with so much struggle in higher ed, and especially in Christian higher ed and seminaries in particular. There's a lot to be grateful for that the Lord seems to be continuing to have his hand of kindness on us. And as we look forward to the future, just a lot to be hopeful for in terms of our global expansion and what's going on with a variety of different demographics and delivery methods, and also with our degree programs. So I hope this is a good overall enrollment and gives you a sense of just the goodness of God to this institution. Thanks so much.